So now we're up to probability, and probability is something that you've been working with your entire life. Whenever you played a game of Candyland or played a hand of poker, it's based on probability, and a lot of that stuff is really something you're used to working with, even if you don't really know it. Even on your way to school today, you were lucky enough to not have an accident, and that's based on the laws of probability as well, and hopefully being in a car with a good driver. So, yeah, so theoretical probability. These are all terms that we need to know. An outcome is the result of any action. An event is an outcome or a group of outcomes. Now, theoretical probability is what we're going to talk about when the probability that you would expect if the conditions were perfectly random. Now, when figuring out the probability, it's done on a scale of 0 to 1. Now, 0 means it's not going to happen. 1 means it's certain to happen. And everything in between is what we normally talk about. So, we're talking about probability because we don't talk about things that are certain or never going to happen. So when you hear that there's a 20% chance of rain, that means 2 out of 10 days it's expected to rain. And that's relatively low in terms of probability, but if it says there's a 95% chance of rain, then it's certain. Every so often you need to get like a 100% chance of rain or no chance of rain. But again, most of the time in terms of weather, there's some doubt between those two a lot of times. That's when you have to worry about what you're going to wear. So an outcome is any possible result. A favorable outcome is the result that you are looking for. So if you have a spinner and you give this a spin, it says here, what is the probability of gaining an even number? Well, we have to count up the amount of possible outcomes there. There's a total of 8 possible outcomes. That's the total amount of outcomes. And there's only 1, 2, 3, 4 that are favorable outcomes. So that's the ratio between those two. And we can simplify that to 1 over 2. Now, what is the probability of getting a number greater than 6? We have 8 possible outcomes. So that's the total possible outcomes. And there's only 2 numbers, 7 and 8, that are greater than 6. It's not 6 or greater, it's greater than 6. So it would be 2. So we now have 1 over 4. And to simplify it, it's just like a ratio or a fraction. So if you look here, what we got here, what's the probability of getting a number less than or equal to 8? Well, again, we got less than or equal to 8. There's 8 possibilities if we spin it. And what are the possibilities getting less than or equal to 8? Well, there's 8. There's 8 possibilities. And there's 8 favorable outcomes because any number I spin will be less than 8. So that would be the example of the 1 probability. And over here again, if I was probably getting a number that's less than 1, well, 8 possibilities, and there's no way of getting it, so this would be a probability of 0. So that's a perfect bet. If you bet on that, that's a really foolish bet. So there's also something called complements, which means what is the probability of spinning a number that is not 3. So we're going to look at what the probability of not getting over here is. And so all we do is we figure out what the possibility of getting 3 is, which we've already covered on some level. This would be 1/8. Because there's 1, there's 3, and there's 8 divisions here. And what we do is we subtract that from 1. When we do that, we end up with 7/8. Remember, we changed this to an 8 over 8. And then we go ahead, and when we do that, we end up with 7/8. So you should be able to figure this out anyhow, just based on the 1, 2, and 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 sections that are not a part of the 3. So you should be able to figure that out anyhow. But anyhow, that's a way of doing it as well. Now, finding the odds is a little bit more difficult. Finding the odds of an event is when you figure out the ratio of the favorable outcomes to the non-favorable outcomes. If you figure out the odds in favor of an event, then the ratio again of the favorable outcomes to the number of unfavorable outcomes. So for this example here, if I was asked, well, what are my odds of spinning a 3? Well, there's only one possible way of spinning a 3. So that's one favorable outcome. And there's 7 possible ways of not spinning a 3. So if you add these two up, you end up with all the possible outcomes because that's a total of 8. And if you look here, when finding odds against an event, it's the ratio of the number of unfavorable outcomes to the number of favorable outcomes. So again, unfavorable outcomes in this case would be, well, there's 7 ways of not getting it, and there's 1 way of getting it. So you add them all up, you get the total amount of outcomes. And it's important to note probability and odds are not the same thing. And what better place to know that from than when you go to Vegas? If you look here, this is a dice chart, and this is what's used, 2 dice in a familiar game called craps, which we'll talk about a bit. And if you look here, if you're asked to stake your life on a roll of the dice, you should, and there's 2 dice, you should say, I'm going to roll a 7, because there's a 6 out of 36 chance of rolling a 7. But if you're talking about here, and there's only 1 out of 36 chance of rolling a 2. Meaning you get 2 ones. So if you see here, Vegas always wins because they are playing by odds, not probability. So if you see, what is the probability of getting a 2? That's 1 out of 36. But what are the odds in favor of getting a 2? Well, there's 1 possible way of doing it. Remember what we're talking about in terms of, I'll write down here, 1 possible way of doing it, and 35 possible ways of not doing it. So that would be the odds instead. And what are the odds against getting a 2? Well, again, there's 35 ways of not getting it. There's 1 way of getting it. So in the game craps, what you do is frequently you try and roll a 7 to begin with, and if you roll a 7, that's great, you win. And so then what happens is that if you roll a 7, your chances of rolling a 7 in this are, well, you got 6 possibilities of rolling 7, and 30 possibilities of not rolling 7. So that's your odds of rolling a 7, which is going to be 1/5, or 1 over 5. Now your odds of not rolling 7, this doesn't look so good. Well, it's going to be 5-1. So when you bet in Vegas, you bet things like, you would go ahead and say, well, I'm betting, this would be an example of, well, I'm going to bet $1 and I get 5 back. And so it's very complicated, but Vegas always wins, so if you stay in a casino long enough, they will take your money. That's the whole goal of Vegas. So, and yeah, that's the important thing. Remember, we will talk about this game. Remember, craps, and we're going to call it Mr. Montgomery's Magical Dice Game, because that's just kind of what I talk about. So that's it.